Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on savings in soil. My name is Emma Adams, and I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And we have produced this webinar with the Royal Countryside Fund to help us understand how we can measure our soil and understand what the results tell us for our future management planning with our farms. So, a little bit about the Farm Carbon Toolkit to start with. So, we as an organisation are created by farmers for farmers. As it mentions there, for over a decade, we've worked with farmers to help us further understand how greenhouse gases work in agriculture. And that also involves looking at how soil health can help us minimise our emissions and help us capture more carbon within our soils and our wider farm landscape. So at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we provide tools and resources for farmers to help us measure and monitor our emissions, alongside further our understanding of how we can minimize our emissions on farm and help maximize that sequestration that we have. So through this, we have our farm carbon calculator, which is free for farmers to use. We also have our farm carbon toolkit, as our name suggests, which is a big online knowledge library whereby you can go on and find out further information about any topics that you are interested in that may come up on this webinar or are involved with emissions or carbon or any other this sort of resource efficiency questions that you may have. We're also very lucky to run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition and the Carbon Farmer of the Year competition and have a big set of trials involved in one of our projects called the Farm Net Zero project based down in Cornwall, where we're looking at novel strategies and measuring what we can do on farm to help with our resource efficiency and the battle against climate change. So for today in this webinar, what are we going to run through? So firstly, we're going to look at why our soil is so important. And then we're going to move to understanding how we test it and how we look after it. Before answering that final question of what's next? What can I do as a farmer to help manage my soil? So why is soil so important? So there's a brilliant understanding that if we protect our soils and look after it, we're likely on farm to have better economic returns. It's often quite an overlooked asset on our farms, but soil is really, really critical to ensuring that we're going to have a brilliant economic return across whichever industry we're working in. So that means keeping it in the field, making sure that we're managing it in a way which is going to benefit our soil health. So that ability of our soil to cope with climatic stresses like droughts or extended periods of heavy rainfall, and those deep, deep winter temperatures that we get. So a healthy soil is a more resilient soil and it's more likely to be able to cope in these extreme environments. It's also important that if we think of soil health, we're thinking about how the structure and that functionality of soil works. So, if we've got a well structured soil, so a soil that sort of resembles a really nice fluffy chocolate cake, so we've got all of those little pore spaces and the little aggregates holding our soil profile together, this structure will actually help us mitigate the risk of loss in regards to erosion or losses of nutrients from the soil. And that might be bits like our organic matter or our phosphates. But it'll also mean we have better water infiltration and gas exchange. So those pores allow for water to be captured by the soil, also have this gas exchange, which helps us with our healthy landscapes and environments, and also helps our crop and grass growth as well. So soil's definitely at the heart of everything we do out on farm, and looking after it is definitely one of the most important things we can do. So this is a really lovely graph which helps illustrate that point. So along the bottom we have our soil organic carbon, which is sort of interchangeable as a concept with soil organic matter in regards to this principle. So our soil organic matter is inherently all of the dead and decaying bits within the soil. So it might be bits of old straw or plant roots, any microorganisms within our soil, and then the organic carbon is a constituent of that organic matter. So it's the carbon part of our organic matter as a whole. So you may have seen historically when you've had testing done or heard it talk about in the media or in webinars such as these about the importance of soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. And inherently these two concepts or phrases are a really strong link and correlation to our soil's fertility. So, a field of higher organic matter or organic carbon is likely to have really good fertility compared to a field which is potentially lower or has been degraded slightly. And we can see that on this graph here. So, as our soil organic carbon or soil organic matter increases, we can see that our soil quality also increases, and those sort of beneficial trends that we like as land managers. So, for example, as we increase our soil organic matter, our organic carbon, and that soil quality, we're likely to have better nutrient retention, better infiltration rates, and we're also likely to mitigate the likelihood of processes such as compaction or erosion, where we're directly losing soil out of the field. So there's a really good correlation, as we were saying before, a healthy soil rich in organic matter or organic carbon, having that sort of inherent resilience and fertility, which is only going to make our life easier as managers, where we can work with the soil rather than fighting against it. So, when we're thinking about why soil is so important, and as a company, obviously, we work with emissions on farm and understanding how soil health fits into all of that. This is a really good image to think how that all fits together. So, what we have here is a picture of the carbon cycle. And if, as in this example, I was a company who manufactured cars, I would take all of the materials required to make a car, so maybe some metal, electricity, water, some rubber for some tires. And throughout that process, I would be emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But at the end, I would have a product to sell of a car. Which would have an associated carbon footprint or carbon balance of that car from the manufacturing process. Now, agriculture is a little different. So, for example, if I was producing beef on my farm, I may take some inputs such as some livestock feed and some fertilizer and maybe some bale wrap for my silage and produce some emissions in using these materials, and at the end produce beef. But the whole time we're doing that, this cow may be out grazing. And during that process, what we have is we actually, some of that carbon dioxide is being captured back into our farmed landscape. So agriculture presents a really unique opportunity in that although we may have some emissions arise as a consequence of producing food or fiber or fuel, we're also capable of capturing a lot of those emissions. So when we think about a carbon footprint or a carbon balance for agriculture, it's actually a measure of all of those emissions that we may have on farm, but also all of that sequestration, which occurs through the capture of our carbon dioxide into our soils, our trees, hedgerows, into those sort of scruffy bits in the corner that we often forget about, but helps build this picture of our landscape that as farmers we're looking after and managing. So agriculture, hugely unique position, and that's why it's so important that we are measuring what's going on farm, understanding how our soils are behaving to understand how we can best look after them for the future. So with that, how do we test our soils? So what we're going to do is just run through a couple of different methods of how we can test our soils. So as a farmer or a land manager, you can have a couple of different methods in your back pocket of what you're going to do to understand what's going on with your soil and how your current management practices might be impacting it, to understand whether what we're doing already is doing a really good job or whether there might be some tweaks we could make along the way. So, first things first, when we're thinking about soil, the best thing we can do is to dig a hole. Now, that can be with a spade or a fork or even a trowel, but digging a hole and understanding what that soil looks like, what's the color like, what does it smell like, all of these sort of factors can help us be guided by how that soil is performing. So, there's a really sort of simple correlation with soil that the darker the color of it, likely the higher that soil organic matter or soil organic carbon is. So if you think of like a peat soil, it would be very, very high in carbon, very dark. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a sand soil, which would be traditionally very low in carbon because of the sort of geology of that the soil itself. So we can use this when we're digging holes around the farm to sort of maybe understand which fields might be slightly higher in organic matter or organic carbon, or the underlying soil types we might have on the farm, just by looking at the variation in colours between fields. And if you've ever been ploughing in fields before, you'll be used to seeing this, where when you turn over that soil, you can see the different ribbons of colour often throughout a field, where you might have a sandy patch or a heavier patch, or you get into a particularly stony bit. So understanding what's going on beneath our feet is really simple as just digging a hole and seeing what colour it is. Does it smell like there's a really lovely smell to a healthy soil, which is really inherent to our human nature, whereas a soil that is potentially less happy might be smelling a bit more acidic or waterlogged, and it doesn't have that sort of richness that a really well functioning soil may have. So, digging a hole, having a smell, having a look, what does it look like? Is it that sort of chocolate cake structure that we're after? So whilst we're there digging a hole, there's a few other things we can do as well. First, we can count our earthworms. So worms are really important within our farm system. They're really good at taking organic matter from the top. So that might be straw or manure or crop residues, and bringing it down into the soil horizon itself. So storing those materials within our soils so that the microorganisms and biology that operate beneath our feet have more food to operate and keep our soils functional and healthy. So earthworms are what we call a indicator species. So if we have a high level of earthworms in a field, it's normally a great indicator that we have really good soil health, that biologically it's functioning really well. And that's because earthworms are sort of top of the food chain. So as a case of if they're there and present and thriving, it's likely that the rest of that food chain is also operating to a really good level. So when we're out digging our holes, checking our colour, seeing what the smell's like, what we're going to do is pull that block of soil apart. So if you've dug a hole, getting your hands in there, pulling it apart, counting how many worms you have. And what this can mean is that between fields again, we can start to see some comparisons. So we can have a look at biologically, how are these fields comparing? Now, with that, if you've got underlying peat within your soils, and they're naturally more acidic, you're likely to have less earthworms potentially just because of that inherent pH of those soils. So don't be discouraged. It's always best to sort of compare either in the field, different areas of a field, between fields, or sort of between different systems. So it might be really interesting to compare a field which has always sort of been cut for silage compared to a field which is always grazed, or an arable field compared to a grassland field. Or another great one we can do is see how many worms and what the colour of the soil is like in the middle of the field compared to under the hedge or under a wall or a bit of the field which isn't within regular management, just to see what the differences are like. Then what we're going to do is write down those scores. So how many earthworms have we got in that field at that time of year? And what we can do is then refer back to that when we go out the next year and have a dig, or if you do it in the spring and the autumn, or changing management, how has that management practice impacted our worms? So another great one to have a look at, start understanding how our soil is functioning. So the third test we can do, which is also free like our first two, is to do a visual evaluation of soil structure, which is otherwise known as a VEST score. And what this score does is it allows us to take something that's quite abstract, so our soil inherently, and that structure of the soil specifically, and assign a score to it. So that again is really useful to compare between systems, so our silage versus grazing, or our arable versus our grassland, and apply a score that we can track year from year to see how our soil is functioning and how that structure is working throughout the year. So how we do our VEST scores is we can use this score sheet here. It was developed by the SIUC up in Scotland, to sort of come up with this scoring system. So what we do is we get a big square of soil. So we're going to dig a hole, three sides of a square on a hole, and then flick out that big clod of soil. And what that gives us is a big chunk of soil which we can pull apart and start to understand how it's structured, how it is held together, and what that means for how our structuring is working. So on this scorecard, you can see that on the left-hand column, there's a column called structure quality. So that is our score, our VEST score. And it goes from a score of 1, which would be sort of determined as friable, or probably the the highest structured soil, the sort of best structured soil, down to a score of 5, which would be considered very compact and likely the poorest structured soil. Now, within that, the underlying texture of your land will make a difference. So, a clay soil, heavy clay, is likely to be far more compact than potentially a sand. So, understanding that your texture does bear an impact on this, it's a really good one to compare within your farm or compare a field year on year, rather than necessarily what your score is compared to a neighbour's, for example, just because of that variation in texture. The other difference is that the scoring is done by pulling that soil apart, having a look at how it breaks. Nature doesn't work in straight lines. So if you're pulling it apart and it's opening like a book, it's likely to be more compact. Whereas if you pull it apart and you get lots of fine aggregates or sort of more circular shaped clumps of soil, it's likely to just have that natural structuring rather than compaction. But because it's a case of pulling it apart, having a look, using this scorecard for yourself to assign a score to it, it means that it's our impression of the soil, it's our own opinion of how that soil is functioning. And as long as it's you doing it each time, that's the best thing we can do, because it's how we're interpreting that soil to be functioning compared to necessarily how your neighbour has interpreted their soil. So it's a really useful tool to sort of check ourselves on how we're getting on. Now, personally, I think most soils, if they're scoring sort of 2 and above, that would be where we'd want to be. If we're getting into that sort of a score of 3 or lower, it might be a case of having a look at what we're doing at the minute and if there's anything we can do to sort of mediate any of the strains on that structure. So it might be a case of we've pulled it apart and it's sort of split into two in those big straight lines. We've got a bit of compaction. Now it might be a case of looking at it and saying, okay, is that compaction in the very top layer? Is it a case of we've just got some wheelings in the field, or we've got a little bit of very surface level compaction from having sheep in there over winter? Or is it lower down where we're finding this really blocky, tough soil to pull apart, whereby it's more of a sort of a plough pan or an inherent compaction within the soil that might need some mechanical intervention, or, a really decent cover crop in there to sort of break apart that pan and have a more free-flowing sort of open structure to our soil. So another really useful test, as I say, these scorecards are available online, and they're circulated in lots of the sort of soil-related literature from the Royal Countryside Fund, and also from advisory services such as ourselves or AHCB, or any other local services. So the fourth test we can do is still free, and we can still do at home on the farm. So it's called aggregate stability testing, or otherwise known as slake testing. And what the idea of this test is, if we've sort of had a visual look at it, and to understand the colour and what might be going on, we've counted our earthworms to understand the biological side of it, the VEST scoring to understand our physical side. The aggregate stability testing can help us sort of draw that picture together in how this soil is going to cope with environmental stress. So what we do, is illustrated in this picture on the right-hand side, is we're going to inherently submerge little clods of soil into water and understand if they hold together over time or whether they break apart. Now, the underlying thinking of this is that if these aggregates remain together in an intact form, they've likely got a really good amount of sort of soil biology going in there, where you've got the glomalin from different microorganisms and the worms and everything else, and the soil organic matter holding those aggregates together like glue. Whereas if we've got samples that are more likely to break apart, and you see them break apart over time, they're less likely to have that sort of inherent biology and organic matter within them. So this setup I've got here is what we do, but that's because we process a lot of soil samples. So you could easily do this in a saucer or an egg cup or a little dish, whereby you're going to want to have sort of a centimetre or two of water, and then all you're going to do is pop little clods of soil, so roughly about a centimetre if possible, into the water, and start the stopwatch. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at those samples after 2 minutes. So what do they look like after 2 minutes? and write down the score, and then what do they look like after 2 hours and write down the score. So that's going to give us an indicator of the resistance to stress over time. So how we score it is using this scorecard on the left-hand side, whereby a score of 0 would suggest that the aggregate is still fully intact, and a score of 4 is that you have no aggregate left. It's completely sort of dissolved into the water in the tray. So another really useful test that we can do at home, again, might be useful to compare those different systems of the farm, of our silage or of a grazing or arable or grassland, and see if there is any trends that emerge from around the farm and how different management might be influencing those underlying changes. So this one is infiltration testing, a tricky one after the winter we've had this year because ground is so saturated, but a useful one to think about when perhaps we're not in such extreme conditions. So infiltration testing is sort of, as it says on the tin, what we're going to test is the time it takes for water to infiltrate into a field. So you can see in the picture in the right-hand side, there's a little ring in the middle of the picture, which we are using to test this infiltration. So how we do it is you get a cylinder of some form. It might be what we're using here, which is a bulk density ring. It could be a proper infiltration test rings. I've seen people do it with a baked bean can or a bit of old scaffolding pole, but inherently what you want to do is tap a cylinder just gently into the soil so it doesn't fall over, and then pour in a known volume of water, just so that every time you test it, it's the same amount of water that needs to infiltrate. So say you pour 50 millimeters of water into that ring, you're then going to start the stopwatch and time how long it takes for that water to disappear. And again, what we're looking at here is soils that are traditionally higher in organic matter likely have a better infiltration rate compared to those with lower if they're on the same soil type. Again, this can help us identify where soil types might be different across the farm, and also understand sort of how that management's happening. The classic one would be, if you have some compaction in the field, which might be a historic sort of track that livestock take across the field, or where we've driven, is going to be more compacted, less likely to infiltrate compared to something which hasn't been trafficked or compacted, where you've got all of that open pore space left and available for that water to infiltrate into. So after those 5 tests, we finally got on to what most people would consider how we would test our soil, and that is soil sampling for lab analysis. So what this might mean is working with your agronomist, a local farm advisor, or even yourself, taking some soil samples across the field to try and get a representative quantity of soil to send off to a lab for analysis. So when it comes to lab analysis, it's important to remember who is the audience for the results. So what are we trying to understand and test for? So is it yourself as the farmer or land manager, and we're wanting to look at this sort of biological, physical, chemical testing? So we can do a lot of that in the field, but it might be that for this chemical testing, we also want to look at getting our phosphorus, potassium, pH, and magnesium measured to understand that sort of traditional nutrient balance of the soil. It might be that you would like to get a mineral N test, understand your nitrogen levels. So it's really thinking, what do I need to test for? What results are going to be beneficial for me? It might be that now, with some of the agri-environment schemes, such as the SFI, you're looking to test to hit the requirements of those schemes. So for the SFI, you'd be looking to test for your soil organic matter. You'd look for texture, and then maybe do a VEST score and our worm count. So with those, you can get a laboratory test for texture. You can also test in field through just running it through your hands and using some guidance. But that would be a test for soil organic matter with the lab. And with those results for the SFI, including that in a not nutrient management plan, sorry, a management plan to understanding the risk that that soil has to these different extremes and weather and everything else. So there's lots of tests that you can send soil for a lab for. It's an ever increasing industry, it seems, whereby you can sort of test the soil for anything, but it's understanding what's going to be useful for you. Are you in, a livestock system whereby you're trying to understand what deficiencies you have in the soil? You might be having some herd health problems. So it might be useful to test the soils for, those micronutrients, whereby you might find you have an underlying deficiency within your soil, which is then leaving you with a deficiency in the grass produced above. So just thinking through, what do we need? What's actually going to be a useful test for us, whereby I can utilize that information at the end of the day. So when to test is also as important as choosing what to test. So it's always good to try and test when we're not in the extremes of weather. So when it's nice spring, autumn temperatures, when we don't have droughts or waterlogged, frozen ground. So it's getting trickier as our climates are changing, but trying to remain consistent in the time of year we test, the style of testing we do in regards to, is it someone walking across the field in a traditional W pattern shape, or is it yourself going out with a spade and grabbing a couple of samples from across the field? If you want to get even more technical with it, you can sort of GPS log where you take your samples from, so that each year, particularly with soil organic matter or soil organic carbon testing, you can go back to the same points, or every few years, you can go back to the same points and understand whether that carbon organic matter has increased or decreased. So you can log those with GPS apps or things like what three words to sort of understand where you've been and then repeat sampling later on. So, with all of that, how do we actually look after our soil? So, most of these things we'll be doing already, but we might not be doing it from a consideration of our soil's perspective. It might just be ingrained within us as we sort of move the cows, or are planning the sort of arable rotation. But the key principles we've got down the left hand side there. So, firstly, we want to protect the soil surface. So these pictures are all taken throughout this sort of autumn spring period we've just been through, and I'm sure they're hugely familiar to everyone here. But it just sort of outlines some of the challenges that as farmers we're facing at the minute. So on the left-hand side there, we've got a field which was a cover crop, I believe, but it is going into spuds, hopefully this spring. But you can see there that, the river's been out. It's now a very tired and sad field because it's just been underwater for so long. So even though we've tried to take some mitigation measures there, potentially our cover crop wasn't big enough, or it's all died off just as a consequence of where it is in the world, and the challenges that we face up and downstream with flooding this year. So there's a lot of soils which are now very exposed and have had a hard winter of runoff, despite what we may have done within our power and our management. So that leads us to this middle picture here of one of the roads locally, whereby, we've had a lot of field drains running, a lot of overwater flow of water, which has meant that we've had a lot of brown rivers and brown streams. And what that is it's the water picking up the particles of soil within our fields and taking it off land into our watercourses. Now, sometimes this is avoidable, and it's particularly on an extreme year, it's going to happen potentially where we're least expecting it, and we can always do our best and still things go wrong. But I think it's important to have a think about where you may have seen brown water running this year, and just see if there's any trends. Is it a case of it's an arable field and it could just have done with a little bit more of a buffer around the hedge, or is it a grassland field that potentially we grazed a little bit tight before that winter period and it just didn't have that grass to cover and buffer that extreme rainfall coming down? But it's just a case of these things happen, but if we can protect the soil surface, it's always going to be the best step to actually looking after our soil itself, keeping those nutrients in the field where we want them, and hopefully help with our resilience by mitigating some of those excess fertilizer bills by maintaining our inherent fertility within the land. So the right hand side is another really good example of how this sort of comes together. So this is a field, one of my colleagues' fields actually, of wheat that was drilled back in the autumn. And what we see here is a gully down the middle of the field. And all this is a tram line. So a really well drilled field. It's obviously come up and dealt with all of the weather really well. But just on this tram line, the water has found a weakness within the field. And it just demonstrates how much soil we can actually lose in a field once it gets going. So you can see there's sort of a good couple of inches worth of soil gone there just as a consequence of a tram line. So protecting the soil surface is really critical to keeping that soil in the field, keeping our costs down and having to re-establish crops and reapply nutrients. So coming on to a more of a grassland situation. So what we can see here is on the left-hand side, we've got some cattle that have just been moved. So I took this back in October, November, so after a good bit of winter weather. But those cattle have come off, but there's still lots of residues where they have come off. It's trampled up a little bit where they've been around in the wet, but there's still a lot of green, there's a lot of cover, and as a consequence of that, that means that the speed of rainfall when it hits the ground is going to get dispersed by that green cover rather than that sort of direct hit onto a bare soil surface. So green cover actually reduces that velocity and the power of our rain. So that's another reason why it's really important. This middle picture is actually a zoomed in picture of what those cattle are grazing, so a really diverse sward. And the benefits of that is a diverse sward has a more diverse rooting architecture. So you might find that in these stressful periods of the year, some plants are obviously more likely to sort of fizzle out and die compared to other ones. So if you have a diverse sward, it's better risk mitigation for that something will be growing, hopefully, or coping with the weather, rather than if, for example, this was just a straight ryegrass lay, it's harder for it to hold the shoulders of the season with less diversity in those rooting structures. And then finally, again, on the right-hand side, this is actually the same farm as the first picture with our potato crop. So this field's also going into spuds and has been grazed, but obviously a much better cover there. It is further away from the river, admittedly, but much better cover and much more resilient to that rainfall and the power of that rain coming down and being able to hold that grassland. So as we've already mentioned, diversity really important to help with that rooting architecture. So how are the roots within our soil diverse in regards to space and time? Is it a crop like oilseed rape with a one big tap root, or is it something like a phacelia with a big net and web of roots, whereby that different shapes and sizes within our soil help support a big range of microorganisms within the soil itself. So diversity is always key within our farm system, be that in a grass lay, whereby we might want to try and get a few different varieties of grass in there, maybe some herbs, maybe some legumes, or in an arable system, whereby we want to try and encourage maintaining that green cover, or maybe using things such as companion crops, cover crops, intercropping, under sowing, all these different mechanisms that we have to introduce diversity into our landscape and how we farm. It's also important to remember that we can introduce diversity to help us with other benefits. So in this field we've got here on the right hand side, this is a field of oilseed rape which has been undersown or co-sown or companion cropped with species of vetch and beans and phacelia. And each of those species has been chosen by the farmer to provide a benefit. So the vetch and the beans are providing some nitrogen fixation potentially. Phacelia, you can do lots of nutrient scavenging. You've also got species like buckwheat, which would help potentially make phosphate more available. So you can use the species that you're sowing or promoting within your farmland to help promote other aspects that would be beneficial to the system. So in livestock systems, it might be things like adding clovers or vetches to help with that nitrogen capture to reduce our artificial fertilizer. It might be looking at species which have anthelmintic properties to help with our worm burden, or even species such as plantain or chicory with really deep roots to help with our any compaction that we might have. So choose your species to see what's going to be beneficial for you, and that diversity is only going to be beneficial for our soils. So optimizing soil structure. So now we're all going to go out and do our VEST tests. We'll know all about our soil structure and how it's functioning. But what we want to try and do is when we're digging our holes and doing our VEST scores is understanding what have we done to get to where we are. So Where are we scoring? If we're scoring a 2 or a 1 on our VEST score, we're probably doing okay. Likewise, if it's lower than that, that might just be inherently within your soil structure, but through your soil type. But what we want to do is try and optimize that as best we can. So understand, is it a case of you have got compaction and could do with some roots in there to sort of break it up, or some mechanical intervention? Is it a drainage problem whereby you've got really saturated acidic soils outside of the extremes of the weather we've had recently, and it might need some drainage? Have you got soils which are potentially depleted in organic matter? And it might be a case of looking at sort of building that fertility back in, either through, as you're saying, our diversity of what we're growing, or organic amendments like putting some muck on, or some compost, or any of these sort of amendments that will help bring some of that organic sort of residues back into our soil, help build that fertility. So, nutrient management planning, another really great way to look after our soils. So, obviously, over time and various pieces of regulation and legislation, we've likely been exposed to nutrient management planning. And it may have been seen as a bit of a chore, of, another bit of paperwork, or potentially a guide to what fertilizer we should be buying, or where our muck's going to go. But it's a really useful tool when we're looking at how we can optimize our soil health and our soil structure, in that understanding. If we have sent off for a test and we now know our PK mag results, or our pH, or our organic matter results, where are the differences across the field? What can we do to help fields come to a better balance? When you've got results which might have, an index 4 for phosphate and an index 1 for potassium, we can look at that that nutrient management plan to understand how we can bring these nutrients better into balance, so that what we have is what the plant or crop or pasture needs for us to have a really resilient farming system. So as it says there, we can look at maybe the use of organic amendments for our soil organic matter, use of legumes and manures that we already have on the farm to reduce our artificial fertilizer. So that might be through manure analysis, slurry analysis, digestate analysis, to understand what nutrients we already have on the farm before we're buying in new nutrients at cost. And now abatement technology for our fertilizers as well, to help us minimize those nitrogen losses and help us maximize our resource efficiency of anything that we're putting on. So finally, with that, we have optimizing our grazing management. And that can come under many different headings and types and all sorts of systems. From this picture we have on the right-hand side here, where we have, really tight mob rotational grazing, where the sheep are getting moved every day, every 2 days or so, in sort of this pizza wheel fashion. Or it might just mean, shutting the animals in a field, shutting the gates, and then moving them a week at a time around the farm on a rotational basis. So what we're trying to do with our grazing management, and what we're looking at, is all about trying to get these rest periods. So this is really important from a grassland perspective, because if we have grass which is in a set stocked system, what that means is the grass itself, the plant, is going to be exposed to a sheep or a cow or whoever coming along and just nibbling the top of the leaves, at any interval. So it means that that plant itself is having to continually put all of its energy and resources into growing that one leaf, which is then going to be eaten off again and just grow up a little bit more, eaten off again, and this sort of cycle that it gets into. What this means is all this energy is going upwards, is that we often have plants with really short roots. Because all of the energy is being put into growing leaves, it means there's not enough left to sort of put into getting these deep roots down. So what rest periods do is, it means that when the plant puts its energy into growing that leaf, if that leaf stays there because it's not being eaten off every 5 minutes, it means the plant can then get its roots down instead. So what we build is resilience into those grasslands, whereby we have a far deeper rooting structure, which means that when it does go dry or it does go wet, we have a plant which is far better able to cope because it has these deep roots which are able to find water and nutrients that it needs to survive, compared to something which only has very short roots and can get very stressed. And that's where we see our burn off and obviously die off when we're in very wet conditions. So that's the beauty of rest periods. It's building that resilience into our grassland for a long-term, more productive lay. So with that, as mentioned, there's so many systems. If we keep the rest period as that sort of key point within our system, you can then sort of look at moving into things like tall grass grazing. So that is where we utilize the principle of graze a third, trample a third, leave a third. And what that is encouraging is through the hooves of our sheep or cattle, or again, whoever we might have, is that we're going to try and through that trampling, get some of that organic residue of the grass back into the soil, sort of trample it in to help speed up that build of fertility within our soils. And again, as already mentioned, that final point there, our desired species content. So going out and having a look at a grass, understanding what we have there to start with, what we actually want to have there. Is it a pasture just full of annual meadow grass, which is actually contributing very little nutritionally or from a diversity perspective? Or have we got what we want there? Have we got some bird's foot trefoil or some timothy or some fescues, or all of that diversity that we like to see within the landscape, and is going to have those knock-on benefits to our soil beneath our feet and also our livestock who graze and live upon it. So with all of that, what is next? So I think it's always really important that when we are measuring and trying to look after something, we're monitoring something, how do we know if we've actually improved our soils? So the biggest indicator we can have is our improving soil health and structure. So those tests that we've talked about earlier, our earthworm tests, our VEST scoring, our aggregate stability, are those metrics improving? Are we managing to maintain those metrics in tricky years, or are we potentially seeing that build of fertility within our system if we're doing any lab tests? Is our organic matter or organic carbon increasing? The other way that people often see that their soils have improved is this maintaining of ground cover. So it might be that you actually have, a week's longer grazing a year because that soil is more resilient, our plants are more resilient. So you might see these benefits within the livestock systems or the arable systems, that you have less burnout. The fields can carry stock for longer and have a more productive output because the soils are more functioning, and therefore the plants or crops that you're growing can increase their functionality in turn. And then finally, at the bottom, the actual functionality of our soil itself. So not only can we extend our grazing or growing season, but actually we have fields that can infiltrate water properly, are getting more fertile. So we need less fertilizer to get to that same endpoint with our crops. And also that recovery time period. It might be that, you're encouraging your rest periods and you take the cattle out and you're used to seeing the grass sort of come back in a couple of weeks. And it might be that the functionality sort of really kicks into that sort of high functioning space, and you get your grass coming back quicker, and less sort of taller grass and more resilient species within it. Another way we can know if our soils have improved is resampling our tested fields every 3 to 5 years. So with soil organic matter, we tend to suggest sort of a 3-year time period for sampling. You can sample every year, but what you can find is that soil fluctuates a lot in the year as it sort of respires and temperature changes and everything else. So the actual carbon content and the organic matter of that field can fluctuate. So by extending the time between sampling, you can help sort of dilute some of that fluctuation to see more of a general trend. Likewise with nutrients, again, you can test every year, or if you're looking at more specific tests like mineral nitrogen, it might be at a certain point of the rotation if you've changed sort of cropping or come out of permanent pasture or put grassland in, and to understand more specifically the demands of that field. But inherently, otherwise, we would look to go sort of every 3 to 5 years on a rotational basis around the farm. Soil management planning, another great one. So through doing all the tests we've outlined today, you might find that there's particular fields with particular demands. So it might be that one field could do with a bit more muck because the organic matter is getting low. It might be that another field has a really high phosphate. So we want to avoid putting muck on there and come up with a strategy of how we're going to mitigate that to avoid any watercourse pollution. So soil management planning to preempt what the risks might be, understand how we can mitigate them, and sort of fit them to within our farming system. And finally, get involved. So we are obviously working with RCF on various projects coming up, but the Farm Carbon Toolkit website is always there. We're always running workshops and webinars. So if you'd ever like any further information on anything soil health or greenhouse gas mitigation, including carbon footprinting or trials, and much, much more, please get in touch with us or go on the website, and we will see how we can help. And that is it from me. Thank you very much for listening. Please get in touch if you have any questions or queries, and we'll be more than happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you all for watching. And if you have any questions, contact Emma. And for more information on our Savings in Soils programme, visit www.royalcountrysidefund.com/savings in soils. Thank you.